All right, so now we're going to go into the fun part of the workshop. So why soil blocking and plastic trays? So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with plastic trays. I brought in some examples of what these look like. So soil blocks, they use a lot less plastic and could be the plastic could be unnecessary altogether. So when we make the soil blocks in terms of just organization in our greenhouse, Johnny's has these soil block trays available, which are great when you're carrying your blocks out to the field to transplant. But I've also just used old pieces of wood that were on the farm, or I've made wooden trays that you can start the blocks on directly. The good thing with this is that it's slotted on the bottom, so if you do end up not getting your plants out when they should, if there's dark enough, well, I'll get into that. Sorry. Maximizes space, more seedlings per square foot. There's no root bounding or transplant shock, and retains moisture better. The blocks air prune, roots are ready to take off and continue growth when potted off. Easier to transplant, you don't have to replace trays every few years. Can work out at round numbers like 100 very easily when crop planting. So for me, all of my beds on the farm are the exact same specs. So it's a 3-foot bed by a 100-foot bed. And I do all of my planning in Excel, and when I'm working out of a square number of 100, it's just a million times easier for keeping track of what's going on. And now that I have all these cubes, I can do everything in increments of 100 or sometimes 50, depending on what the spacing is. And it's just that's a lot easier in my head for planning. So I'm sure a lot of you guys at a gardening scale don't have 100 of anything in your backyard, so it might not be as relevant. And then also, you're getting more soil volume per square foot in your greenhouse. So I'm going to go over some of this with this. So this is the top of the tray, and if we turn it backwards, you have all this space where there's nothing going on. So for me, I want to maximize the amount of space in my greenhouse so I could utilize it to its full capacity. So when I can fit 600 trays in my greenhouse, and if I was using these, that's a lot of space that's not being used and it's being taken up by this big tray. Whereas when we make our soil blocks, I fill up this tray, it covers the entire area of this. So I'm actually getting probably almost double the amount of soil per square inch in my greenhouse than what I would get out of a conventional seedling tray. So what else? Less plastic use, remember that, maximizes space. So root bounding, so I'm sure everyone's familiar when you bought pre-potted plants or you have a house plant or whatever, and then you're ready to transplant and you pull it out and you have this web of white roots that are all around the outside. That's really bad. You don't want that to happen really ever, because once the plant hits its limitation, it's going to realize that that's all the space that it has, and it's going to take way longer for it to progress. So when you start seeds in here, and then they're root bound and you're going out into the field, it will probably take about 5 days to a week for the seedling to even realize that it has more space to grow and get larger. So if you've noticed that when you plant root bound plants, they're pretty much the same size for like a week before they start to take off, because the roots are so wound up, it takes a while for them to spread out. So when we make the soil blocks, there's an air barrier in between each of them. So where these dividers are ends up being a small little pocket of air in between each block. So roots don't grow in air, so they naturally root prune themselves. So when we have our soil blocks, they're never going to really get root bound unless you neglect the tray and it's there for 2 or 3 weeks. The roots are going to find a spot to go into the block next to them. But we want to do, to the best of our ability, make sure that never happens. So it's easier to get your plants not root bound when you're using soil blocks. Okay, so just a quick history on soil blocks. So Elliot Coleman, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with him. He started in the 70s in his farm, pretty much anti-buying plastic trays that you need to throw out every 2 years and buy new stuff. So he would make these giant trays that were kind of like this, but just made out of wood. Then he would just fill the whole thing up with soil, and then stick his finger in, and then put the seeds in. And then once they were done, he would just take an old knife and cut them into cubes and transplant them. And then he was at a farming expo in Europe in the 70s, and in Holland they developed the Soilblock maker. So he saw it was a little bit different than this. He saw it, fell in love with it, hooked up with some engineers, and then they were able to manufacture them. And Johnny's has been making them for about, I think, 20 or 30 years now. So I was invited to go to the Slow Tools conference, which I'm wearing right now, which is at the Stone Barn Center in New York. And one thing that I was very excited about is that they're working on building a soil blocker that's in this bottom picture that fits, it's designed to fit exactly into this tray. So when you're at a large scale like us, what we end up doing is, because the dimensions of the blocker aren't exactly the same size as the tray, so I want to maximize my space, and if I just do it centered, that's like a whole 20 blocks that I can't fit in here. So what we end up doing is making them and lay them out on a table, and then we kind of assemble a line and like make an L, and then someone else comes along and places the rest in. So it's a pretty long process, and this is the third prototype that they developed that will set in and make an entire tray in one shot. And I got to demo it, and it took like 20 seconds to make a tray, where it takes us about a minute and 20 seconds to do it the way that we're doing it right now. So I'm very excited about that when that comes out. Okay, so another thing, so when we start a lot of our seeds, we start them in this tiny 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch block, which is pretty small. When we make the mix for this, it's pretty much mostly peat moss, a little bit of limestone, and a very small amount of compost, because when every seed has enough energy in it to get that seed to have past its germination leaves to its first set of true leaves. And it's not until that point when it actually needs food. So going back to don't start your seeds just in compost, because that's a pretty intense environment that has a lot of food in it, and the seed doesn't need all of that when it's beginning. And also, I don't want to be wasting, the peat moss is probably the least expensive thing, all the other stuff is more expensive, so I don't want to be putting all this time into putting these active minerals in the beginning when the plant doesn't need it. Also, when we buy seeds, not every seed is of the best quality. A lot of them are sifted off, and we get the seconds when we buy them from the seed companies that we go through. So, and I want to make sure, I'm going through all this effort, I want to make sure that the seeds that have the best quality and the best DNA and energy from their mother plants are going out into the field. So this is an example, looks like this is some brassica. So in one of these trays I could fit about, I think, 330 seedlings in the 1/2 inch blocks in one tray. So I let them all germinate, and as you can see, some of them don't look as good. That one barely came up. Some of them are yellow, some of them have uneven leaves. So those, I don't want to put them out into the field because they started off weak. I want to start with the healthiest plants going out into the field. I don't want to put my energy into trying to save that because it already started out bad. So you just got to cull it and get rid of it. So now when I'm going through, I'm going to go through this tray and pick out the ones that look the best to me, that look like they're the strongest and are going to really thrive. And then I pick those ones and then put them into the next largest block. So once we make our soil mix, we're all going to get to experiment with that. So you can pick, there's a few different sizes, but as the blocks get bigger, as you can see, there's a little insert in the inside that's the exact same size of the little block. So what we do is, as soon as those first leaves come up, on the bottom, there's just going to be one tiny taproot, the first taproot that you can see on the bottom, like a speck of white. So if that gets any longer than like that much, you want to get that into the next size block or out into the field as quick as possible, because we don't want the plant to ever know that it's limited to the space that it's in, because that's going to affect its growth throughout the rest of its life. So it allows us to pick only the best, healthiest looking cotyledons, which are the first germination leaves. For every bad seedling, you're losing a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch cube, which isn't really that much if I lose that much soil. And we just have a bucket that we put all the bad ones in, and we just recycle it into our compost, and it gets reused. Once first true leaves appear and the taproot is becoming present at the bottom, it's time to move up. And again, timing. So, but not to worry with this method, even if you're too late, like really late, you're still going to be in a way better situation than you were if you were too late in one of these trays. So you're already in a better situation. Okay. So lastly, locating your materials. Try to avoid your local big box retailers if possible. I always try to buy things from local enterprises, so the money that I'm laboring over stays in my community. And also a lot of the materials that they're getting at Home Depot and Lowe's are poor quality. We want to make sure that we have the best quality stuff that we're starting to grow our food in. If you can't find these things at your local garden center or nursery, now we have Amazon, which is a crazy matrix that we can pretty much get anything that we possibly can imagine on. So let's use that to our advantage. These are all companies that I use on a regular basis that I highly advocate. So Johnny's, Neck and Row, Lancaster Ag, Vermont Compost, Ciagra, Knowles Produce Supply for some minerals, a lot of farm equipment and pots and stuff you can get from them. Logan Labs is the lab that I use to send all of my soil tests to. They have a full spectrum of trace minerals and elements that they can do, so you get a very comprehensive soil test, and they're very willing to help you over the phone with helping you analyze what these parts per million things mean, because that's kind of like confusing to us. And then Fedco and the Azonite. Okay, so now we're going to get started finally. So the first step that you want to do when we're making the soil blocks is sift your compost and your peat moss. So we have a thing that we kind of made that we don't really use all the time. That's kind of like that, a giant trommel. We mainly use screens like this to sift everything, but to avoid a giant mess in the time that it takes, I have some pre-sifted peat moss for here. So I advise you guys to touch this so you can feel what it looks like. You don't want any clumps or twigs or any large debris, because when you're putting them into these tiny molds, that could take up space and you're going to get a brittle block, which will then fall apart.
What's the what percentage?
That's peat moss, like a handful of lime, and maybe a quart of compost. That's about it. You can honestly get away when you're starting out with just peat moss for the small blocks.
What mesh screen will that pass through?
That was a 1/4-inch screen.
Okay.
So just like a regular, almost like the thinnest chicken wire you can get at a hardware store.
Okay, can you give me that recipe again? You said
this
mostly
is-
peat moss with
Yeah, peat moss, it's a little bit of limestone and about a quart of compost, so not much. And this is, so when we're making all of our different block sizes, we kind of have, we call it like soil mix A, soil mix B, soil mix C. So this is what we use for the smallest blocks, and that's the base of what we use in all the other things. So like I said, the larger blocks, we don't need all these nutrients and minerals in it. So we make this in large quantities, sifted, and then for the next size up, then we'll add maybe some more compost, some sand and perlite, etc.
Isn't the proportion of the peat moss and the lime important in order to get your pH right?
Yeah, so I add, the peat moss has a high pH, so you want to make, whenever you use peat moss, you want to have some limestone to balance out the pH in the soil. But I don't really measure that for this mix, I kind of just add it. So I would say maybe that was 2 5-gallon buckets of peat moss, and I added a quart of lime. So I guess a pint of lime per 5-gallon bucket would probably do your job. All right, so then we're going to, all right, so who wants to be my soil making volunteer? Or 2 people? We're going to walk through the whole process. All right, everyone wants to. All right, so whoever walks up first.